Air crackled with ancient magic. He stood across crowded ballrooms, radiating lethal dominance. Alpha King Declan Ridge rarely smiled. When Hazel blew a sarcastic kiss on a foolish dare, his hand snapped up, snatching her invisible gesture from midair. His lips mouthed 4 terrifying words. Come get it back. Blackwood University was supposed to be neutral ground, a sanctuary where humans and wolves mingled under the strict treaty of the Northern Territories. For Hazel Jenkins, it was simply a place to hide. Born a latent wolf, a rare genetic anomaly that left her with heightened senses but no ability to shift. Hazel had spent 21 years mastering the art of invisibility. She wore oversized sweaters, masked her natural scent with harsh botanical soaps, and kept her eyes firmly glued to the floor. Her roommate, Chloe Brighton, was the exact opposite. Chloe was a beta's daughter from the vibrant Suncrest pack, a girl whose laughter was as loud as her stilettos. It was Chloe who had dragged Hazel to the annual Founders Gala, forcing her into an emerald green silk dress that clung to curves Hazel usually kept buried under layers of wool. You look breathtaking, Hayes, Chloe slurred slightly, leaning against a marble pillar in the grand ballroom. She took another sip of champagne, her eyes scanning the sea of elite wolves and wealthy human benefactors. For once, stop trying to blend into the wallpaper. The wallpaper is safe, Hazel muttered, tugging uncomfortably at the hem of her dress. The ballroom was suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and the underlying metallic tang of shifting alpha pheromones. Can we just go back to the dorms? I have a sociology paper due. Absolutely not, Chloe gasped, her eyes suddenly widening. She grabbed Hazel's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Hazel's skin. Look, up there, on the VIP balcony. Hazel followed Chloe's gaze, and her breath hitched in her throat. Standing at the edge of the wrought iron balcony looking down at the crowd was Declan Ridge. He wasn't just an alpha. He was the Alpha King of the unified Northern Packs. Declan was a legend, whispered about in terrified hushes. He was ruthlessly efficient, fiercely territorial, and devastatingly handsome in a way that felt entirely predatory. Dressed in a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, he surveyed the ballroom with cold, amber eyes. Beside him stood his lead, enforcer, a giant of a man named Gideon, who looked ready to snap the neck of anyone who breathed too loudly. He is terrifying, Hazel whispered, her latent instincts screaming at her to drop her gaze and expose her throat. He's gorgeous, Chloe corrected, a wicked, champagne-fueled grin spreading across her face. I heard he's here looking for a mate. The council is pressuring him to produce an heir. He looks like he'd rather eat a mate than marry one, Hazel replied dryly, finally looking away. Let's go, Chloe. Wait. Chloe's eyes gleamed with a dangerous, mischievous light. I dare you. Hazel froze. No, whatever it is, no, I dare you to blow him a kiss, Chloe said, her voice dropping to an excited whisper. Are you insane? Hazel hissed, her heart hammering against her ribs. That is the Alpha King. He could have me exiled or worse, executed for disrespecting him. Oh, please, Chloe scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. We are in a sea of 500 people. The lighting is terrible, and he's 50 feet up. He won't even see you, but I will. If you do it, I will do your laundry for the rest of the semester, including the gym clothes. Hazel hesitated. The offer was incredibly tempting. Chloe's laundry habits were notoriously pristine, and Hazel was drowning in coursework. She glanced back up at the balcony. Declan Ridge was looking in the opposite direction, speaking to someone in the shadows. He wasn't paying attention to the lower floor. The thumping bass of the orchestra and the swirling mass of dancing bodies offered the perfect cover. You're an idiot, Chloe, Hazel muttered. Laundry. Until May? Chloe sing-songed. Hazel sighed, a rush of reckless adrenaline suddenly piercing through her usual anxiety. It was a harmless joke, a silly, fleeting moment in a crowded room. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stared directly at the balcony. She raised her right hand, pressed her fingertips to her lips, and, with a dramatic, exaggerated flourish, blew a kiss toward the Alpha King. In that exact fraction of a second, Declan Ridge turned his head. Time seemed to fracture. The music faded into a dull, distant hum. The swirling crowd vanished from Hazel's peripheral vision. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, Declan's piercing amber eyes locked onto Hazel's. There was no confusion, no missing her in the crowd. He saw her, and then the impossible happened. Declan raised his hand, his gaze never breaking from hers. He didn't swat the air dismissively. He didn't look offended. Instead, his large, scarred hand snapped shut in midair, his fist clenching tight as if he had literally caught the invisible gesture she had thrown at him. A collective shiver ran down Hazel's spine. The air grew impossibly heavy. Declan slowly lowered his closed fist to his chest, resting it right over his heart. A slow, dark smirk ghosted across his lips. He raised his other hand, pointing a single, definitive finger directly at Hazel. Then, he exaggeratedly mouthed 4 words that made Hazel's blood run ice cold. "Come, get it back." "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, suddenly completely sober. "Hazel, he saw you." Hazel didn't wait. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized her. She ripped her arm from Chloe's grasp, hiked up the skirt of her emerald dress, and bolted toward the emergency exit, tearing through the crowd like a hunted animal. Dawn broke over Blackwood University with a miserable, freezing drizzle, perfectly matching Hazel's internal state. She hadn't slept a wink. Her small dorm room looked like the site of a natural disaster. Clothes were strewn everywhere as she frantically shoved her meager belongings into a faded canvas duffel bag. "Hazel, please stop," Chloe begged from her bed, clutching a pillow to her chest. She looked pale and guilt-stricken. "You're overreacting. He was probably just messing with you. He's a king. He has a million things to worry about today. He's not going to track down a random college student over a fake kiss." "You don't understand," Hazel snapped, zipping the duffel bag with trembling hands. "You didn't see his eyes, Chloe. The way he looked at me. It wasn't a joke. It was a promise. I am a latent wolf with no pack protection. If he decides I insulted his honor, I have no one to defend me. I need to get to my aunt's place in Vermont until this blows over." "Hazel." A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the room. Both girls froze. The heavy oak door of their dorm room seemed to rattle on its hinges. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic knock of the resident advisor. It was the sound of someone who commanded entry. "Don't answer it," Hazel whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hazel Jenkins." A deep, gravelly voice rumbled through the wood. "Open the door." By order of the Alpha King, Chloe let out a tiny squeak of terror and pulled her blanket over her head. Hazel closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. There was no running now. Trying to flee from an enforcer would only elevate her status from annoying student to active threat. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she smoothed down her oversized gray sweater, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Gideon filled the doorframe. The lead enforcer was even more massive, up close, a towering mountain of muscle and scars, dressed in a flawless black suit. He looked down at Hazel, his expression completely unreadable, though his nostrils flared slightly as he took in her scent. "Miss Jenkins," Gideon said, his tone perfectly polite but leaving absolutely no room for argument. "My Alpha requests your presence at the estate. Immediately. I have classes," Hazel stammered, hating how weak her voice sounded. Gideon's eyes flicked to the packed duffel bag sitting on her bed. "It appears you were preparing for an absence anyway. The car is waiting downstairs." There was no choice. 20 minutes later, Hazel was sitting in the back of a luxury SUV with tinted windows, speeding away from the campus and deep into the dense, ancient pine forest that bordered the university. The Ridge Estate was a fortress of stone and glass, built into the side of a mountain, overlooking a deep gorge. It was beautiful, but to Hazel, it looked exactly like a prison. Gideon escorted her silently through grand hallways, lined with historical tapestries and modern art, finally stopping in front of a massive set of double oak doors. He opened them without knocking and gestured for her to enter. Hazel stepped inside. The office was vast, smelling of rich mahogany, aged scotch, and the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of pine and thunderstorms. Declan's scent. It was so potent here that Hazel's latent wolf whimpered in submission, forcing her to consciously lock her knees to keep from collapsing. Declan Ridge was seated behind a massive desk, illuminated by the overcast light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't look up from the documents he was reading. "Sit," he commanded softly. Hazel practically fell into the leather chair opposite him. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. For an agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the scratching of his expensive pen against paper. Finally, Declan set the pen down, steepled his fingers, and lifted his gaze to meet hers. Up close, his amber eyes were mesmerizing, flecked with gold and burning with intense, calculating intelligence. "Hazel Jenkins," he said slowly, testing the syllables of her name on his tongue. "A 21-year-old sociology major on a partial academic scholarship. No recorded PAC affiliation. No shift record. You present as human on paper. Yet," he leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the desk, "you don't smell human." "I'm a latent," Hazel said, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "It's on my extended medical file." "I know what's on your file," Declan replied smoothly. He reached into his suit jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and predatory. He pulled out a closed fist and rested it on the desk between them. "What I want to know is why a supposed latent is hiding beneath layers of chemical scent maskers." Hazel's blood ran cold. "I wear botanical soap. Latents have sensitive skin." Declan chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that resonated in Hazel's chest. "Lie to me again, little wolf, and we will have a very different kind of conversation. You use wolfsbane-infused lather. It's highly toxic, illegal without a medical permit, and incredibly painful to endure. The only reason someone puts themselves through that agony is to hide a scent that would get them killed." Hazel stared at him, paralyzed. How did he know? She had been so careful. Declan slowly opened his closed fist. Sitting in the center of his palm was nothing but air, but his eyes never left hers. "Last night, you threw something at me. I caught it. But when I caught it, the draft from the ballroom floor carried a slip of your real scent up to the balcony." He stood up, walking slowly around the desk. Hazel's breathing turned shallow as his massive frame shadowed her. He stopped right behind her chair, leaning down so his mouth was hovering just inches from her ear. "Pine, wild honey, and silver ash," he murmured, his breath brushing against her skin. "The distinct, unmistakable scent of the Crescent Moonblood lineage, a bloodline that was supposedly eradicated 50 years ago for treason." Hazel closed her eyes, a tear finally escaping and slipping down her cheek. Her family's darkest, most closely guarded secret, the reason she lived her life in the shadows, had been undone by a single, stupid dare. Declan placed a hand on the back of her chair. "So, Hazel, you came to get your kiss back. But I think you and I are going to have to renegotiate the terms of your surrender." Silence stretched, suffocating and thick. Hazel stared at the Alpha King, her lungs burning as she forgot how to breathe. The Crescent Moonblood lineage. It was a fairy tale her grandmother used to whisper in locked rooms with the curtains drawn. A bedtime story about the original healers and truth-seers of the Northern Pacts, who were slaughtered for possessing too much power. "I don't know what you are talking about," Hazel lied, her voice trembling. "My parents were nobodies. Rogues who died in a car crash." Declan's amber eyes hardened. "Your parents were hunted, Hazel. Just as you will be if the High Council discovers you exist. The Council operates out of the ancestral stronghold, clinging to medieval laws that mandate the execution of any surviving Crescents." He stepped back, the oppressive weight of his alpha aura receding just enough for her to draw a ragged breath. "But lucky for you, I despise the Council." "What do you want from me?" she whispered, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "Legitimacy," Declan answered flatly. "The Council is attempting to force me into a mating contract with a highborn female from the Silver Lake Pack to dilute my authority. They think I am a tyrant. They want a puppet queen. But ancient pack law states that if an Alpha King finds his fated mate, the Council cannot overrule the bond. Hazel's eyes widened. You want me to fake a mating bond? With you? I am a latent. I can't even shift. They will never believe it. They will believe it because you are not a latent, Hazel. You are dormant. And until we figure out how to wake your wolf, your scent maskers will have to do. You will come with me to the winter stronghold in the Frost Peaks. We will play the part of a fiercely bonded pair. Declan's expression turned lethal. In exchange, you get the absolute protection of my name. No one touches the Alpha King's mate. She had no choice. Her secret was out, and returning to her mundane life was no longer an option. Within the hour, they were back in the armored SUV, leaving the modern comforts of Blackwood University behind. As they drove further north, the landscape shifted dramatically. Asphalt turned to rugged dirt roads, and the architecture morphed from sleek glass buildings to ancient, looming stone fortresses that guarded the territorial borders. The deeper they went into the Packlands, the more the world felt like it had slipped centuries back in time. As twilight approached, the SUV slowed to a halt at a heavy, iron-wrought border checkpoint. Rain had turned to sleet, drumming harshly against the windshield. Gideon rolled down the driver's side window as a pack officer, a warden, approached. The warden's badge gleamed dull silver against his heavy tactical jacket. His name tag read Briggs. Routine inspection. By order of the council, Warden Briggs sneered, shining a blinding tactical flashlight directly into the back seat, intentionally illuminating Hazel's face. He was a large, brutish man who reeked of cheap cigars and deeply ingrained prejudice. Warden, Gideon rumbled, a warning in his deep voice. Lower the light. You know whose vehicle this is. Briggs smirked, deliberately keeping the beam on Hazel. I know the king is in the back. But the council issued new mandates. All undocumented humans and latents must be thoroughly searched for contraband. And this one, Briggs leaned closer, sniffing the air aggressively through the cracked window, his face contorted in disgust. Reeks of chemicals. Fucking genetic defectives. Mutts shouldn't be allowed past the outer perimeter, let alone riding in royal transport. Step out of the vehicle, girl. I need to pat you down. Hazel's stomach plummeted. This was exactly the kind of pack officer she had spent her life avoiding, corrupt, drunk on a sliver of authority, and harboring a violent hatred for anyone he deemed biologically inferior. I said, Step out, mutt, Briggs barked, slamming his heavy fist against the tinted glass of her door. Before Hazel could even flinch, a terrifying, low snarl vibrated through the confines of the SUV. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop 20 degrees. Declan didn't open his door. He simply kicked it. The reinforced steel door blew open with the force of a bomb, striking Warden Briggs squarely in the chest and sending the massive man flying backward into the frozen mud. Declan stepped out into the sleet, moving with predatory, fluid grace. He didn't look like a man in a tailored suit anymore. He looked like an apex predator, seconds away from a kill. Briggs groaned, scrambling to his feet, his hand instinctively dropping to the silver-loaded sidearm at his hip. You can't do that. I am a council-appointed officer. Declan closed the distance in a blur of motion. His hand clamped around Briggs's throat, lifting the 300-pound officer entirely off the ground. Briggs choked, his boots kicking desperately in the air, as his face turned a mottled purple. You dare speak to her? Declan's voice was a demonic, echoing register that made the surrounding checkpoint guards drop to their knees in immediate submission. You dare shine a light in the eyes of your future queen? Briggs's eyes bulged in absolute terror. Q Queen? He wheezed. You are a disgrace to the badge you wear, Briggs. Declan snarled, his grip tightening, just enough to crack cartilage. You use your rank to terrorize those you deem weak. Your career ends tonight. If I ever see your face inside my borders again, I will tear your throat out with my teeth. Strip him of his rank, Gideon. Throw him in the holding cells for assaulting a royal passenger. Declan tossed the hulking man aside like a rag doll. Briggs hit the dirt, coughing violently, utterly humiliated and broken, as Gideon stepped out to strip the badge from his chest. Declan slid back into the SUV, pulling the door shut. He adjusted his cuffs, his breathing perfectly even, though his amber eyes still burned with residual alpha fury. He glanced at Hazel, who was pressed against the far door, trembling. "No one," Declan said quietly, the monstrous echo gone from his voice, "will ever speak to you like that again." They traveled for 2 more days, ascending higher into the jagged Frostpeak Mountains. The modern world was a distant memory now, replaced by towering pines and ancient stone bridges spanning bottomless ravines. On the 3rd afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. "Storm is moving in faster than the meteorological reports predicted," Gideon noted from the front seat, his eyes locked on the treacherous, winding mountain pass. Snow was already beginning to fall, thick and blinding. "Push through," Declan ordered, staring out the window. "We are only 20 miles from the stronghold. I don't want to be caught on the exposed ridge." But the storm wasn't natural. 10 minutes later, the gentle snowfall erupted into a catastrophic, roaring blizzard. Whiteout conditions hit with the force of a freight train. The wind howled like a dying animal, violently shaking the heavy SUV. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that ice crystallized on the inside of the windows. "Alfra," Gideon said tightly, fighting the steering wheel. "The road. It's gone." "What do you mean it's gone?" Declan leaned forward. Through the blinding curtain of white, the headlights illuminated a sheer drop. The ancient stone bridge that connected the eastern pass to the stronghold had been completely blown out. Crumbled rock and twisted iron disappeared into the roaring chasm below. "Sabotage," Declan hissed, his jaw clenching. "Lord Kensington, that treacherous snake, he knew our route. He had the bridge destroyed." Before Gideon could throw the vehicle in reverse, a deafening crack echoed over the wind. The mountainside above them shuddered. "Avalanche!" Gideon roared. "Out of the car!" "Now!" Declan yelled, grabbing Hazel by the waist and hurling his shoulder against her door, forcing it open against the gale-force winds. They spilled out into the knee-deep snow just as thousands of tons of ice, rock, and white powder slammed into the mountain road. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that knocked the breath from Hazel's lungs. Declan's massive body covered hers, shielding her as the shockwave threw them into the dense tree line. When the roaring finally stopped, Hazel opened her eyes to total darkness. The SUV was gone, buried under a mountain of snow. Gideon was nowhere to be seen. "Declan?" She panicked, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. "I'm here," a pained voice ground out. Hazel sat up, brushing the snow from her eyes. Declan was leaning heavily against a fractured pine tree. A jagged piece of metal debris from the car was embedded deep in his thigh, soaking his ruined suit pants in dark, freezing blood. "We have to move," Declan rasped, his teeth chattering as his body fought to heal around the cold steel. "Kensington didn't just cause an avalanche. He will have sent mercenaries to ensure the job is done. If we stay here, we freeze, or we bleed." "You can barely walk," Hazel said, panic rising as the sub-zero temperature began to bite through her coat. She was already losing feeling in her fingers. "There is an old watchtower," he breathed, pointing a trembling, blood-stained finger up the treacherous slope. "A remnant of the old wars. 1/2 mile. We make it there, or we die." The trek was a nightmare of agony and sheer willpower. Hazel, driven by a raw, primal survival instinct she didn't know she possessed, wedged herself under Declan's arm, acting as a crutch for the massive Alpha. The wind battered them, slicing through their clothes like glass. Every step felt like lifting lead. By the time the ruined silhouette of the stone watchtower appeared through the whiteout, Hazel's vision was blurring with dark spots. Hypothermia was setting in. They collapsed through the rotting wooden door, spilling onto the dry, dusty stone floor inside. It was desolate and freezing, but the thick stone walls blocked the lethal wind. Declan groaned, ripping the metal shard from his leg with a sickening squelch. He immediately shifted half-form, allowing his internal wolf temperature to skyrocket to heal the wound. But the blood loss was severe. He slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. Hazel was shivering violently, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. She curled into a ball on the stone floor, her body violently convulsing as the cold shut down her organs. "Hazel," Declan commanded softly. "Come here." She couldn't move. Her limbs refused to obey, cursing. Declan dragged himself across the floor. He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his massive, burning-hot arms around her freezing frame. He unbuttoned his ruined coat and pressed her directly against his chest, using his supernatural alpha heat as a furnace. "Stay with me, little wolf," he murmured, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Don't let the cold take you." I'm so cold," she stuttered, her teeth clicking together. "I know," he soothed, his hand rubbing vigorous circles on her back to stimulate blood flow. For hours, they sat in the pitch black, the storm screaming outside. Slowly, the violent shivering subsided as Declan's body heat seeped into her bones. Pressed intimately against him, Hazel could hear the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat. The terrifying Alpha King who had ordered her captured was currently draining his own energy reserves to keep her alive. "Why?" Hazel whispered into the dark, her cheek resting over his heart. "If Kensington wants you dead, I am a liability. You could have shifted and run faster without me." Declan was silent for a long moment. His fingers gently tangled in her hair. "Because you blew me a kiss, Hazel Jenkins," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against her ear. "And an Alpha King always keeps what is given to him." Before Hazel could process the weight of his words, a sound cut through the howling wind outside. It wasn't the storm. It was the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Multiple pairs. Declan's body instantly went rigid. His eyes flared, glowing gold in the dark. "Mercenaries," he hissed, his muscles coiling like a spring. "They found us." Because of the blood loss and the energy spent keeping her warm, he was weak. If they breached the door, it would be a slaughter. As the rotting wood of the door began to splinter under a heavy axe blow from outside, something ancient and terrible snapped inside Hazel. The paralyzing fear vanished, replaced by a searing, blinding heat that started in her chest and exploded outward. The scent of pine, wild honey, and silver ash suddenly filled the small room, so overwhelming it made the air vibrate. The latent was waking up. The rotting timber of the watchtower door exploded inward, sending a shower of lethal, jagged splinters across the stone floor. The freezing blizzard howled through the breach, carrying with it the metallic, pungent stench of human mercenaries and silver-laced weaponry. 4 men stepped through the ruined doorway. They were dressed in heavy tactical winter gear, their faces obscured by thermal masks. Leading them was Donovan Reed, a notorious ex-military contractor whose private security firm, Aegis Solutions, was known for taking deep-pocketed, off-the-books assassination contracts. Reed lowered a heavy, silver-loaded breaching shotgun, his thermal goggles glowing an eerie green in the pitch-black tower. "Target acquired." Reed barked into his shoulder radio, his voice a mechanical rasp. "The king is down. I don't see the girl. Finish him, secure his head for Kensington, and let's get out of this icebox." Declan dragged himself upward, ignoring the catastrophic blood loss that was causing the world to spin. He pushed Hazel behind him, shielding her freezing body with his own. Even crippled, the Alpha King radiated a terrifying, suicidal defiance. He bared his fangs, a deep, rumbling snarl, vibrating off the stone walls. If he was going to die in this frozen hellscape, he was going to take every single one of these men with him. "Stay down, Hazel," Declan growled, his muscles trembling as he prepared to launch himself at Reed's throat. But Hazel couldn't stay down. The terror that had paralyzed her minutes ago was entirely gone. In its place, a scorching, white-hot inferno erupted inside her chest. It felt as though a star had collapsed within her ribcage. The scent of wild honey, pine, and silver ash, the biological signature of the Crescent Moonblood lineage, intensified 1,000-fold, becoming so thick and heavy that the mercenaries physically staggered backward, gagging under the pressure of her sudden, overwhelming pheromones. "What the hell is that smell?" One of the mercenaries panicked, dropping his rifle to clutch his throat. "Shoot the Alpha!" Reed screamed, leveling his shotgun. He pulled the trigger. The deafening blast of silver buckshot tore through the air, aimed directly at Declan's chest. But the bullets never reached him. Hazel moved faster than the human eye could track. A shockwave of pure, blinding silver energy blasted outward from her fragile human body, throwing Declan safely to the ground and freezing the silver buckshot, suspended in midair. The bullets hit an invisible wall of raw, kinetic, pack magic, clattering harmlessly to the stone floor. Reed stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror beneath his tactical mask. What? What are you? Hazel didn't answer. She couldn't. Human vocal cords were no longer equipped for the sound, tearing its way out of her throat. It was a howl that predated the modern packs, a sound of ancient forests, forgotten bloodlines, and righteous, devastating wrath. Her bones snapped and elongated with sickening crunches, but there was no pain, only violent, euphoric liberation. The dormant gene, suppressed for 2 decades by chemical washes and sheer terror, finally violently awakened. Brilliant, blinding light engulfed the room. When the light faded, Hazel Jenkins, the quiet, invisible sociology major, was gone. Standing in her place was a monstrous, breathtaking beast. She was a dire wolf, easily the size of a draft horse, her fur the color of spun moonlight and fresh snow. Ethereal, silver mist rolled off her massive shoulders, and her eyes burned with a glowing, terrifying luminescence. The Crescent Healers were not just pacifists. They were the Earth's original defenders, possessing magic that the High Council had feared so deeply they committed genocide to erase it. Hazel turned her massive, glowing eyes toward Declan. The Alpha King was staring at her, utterly mesmerized, his own pain forgotten in the presence of his mate's true form. Hazel lowered her massive head and nudged Declan's bleeding thigh with her snout. A pulse of warm, silver light flowed from her fur into his wound. The torn flesh, poisoned by the rusted metal of the car wreckage, instantly knit itself back together. The infection was purged, the blood loss reversed. In seconds, the Alpha King was completely healed. Declan stood up, rolling his broad shoulders. A dark, lethal smirk crossed his face, and his amber eyes shifted to a glowing, predatory gold. "You boys," Declan whispered, his voice echoing with demonic, dual-toned timbre, made a terrible miscalculation. Hazel didn't wait for a command. The Silver Wolf launched herself across the room. She hit the first mercenary like a freight train, her massive jaws crushing his tactical rifle into useless shrapnel before she hurled him through the open doorway and into the raging blizzard. The second man screamed, pulling a silver combat knife, but Hazel simply swiped her massive, clawed paw, sending him crashing into the stone wall with bone-shattering force. Reed scrambled backward, frantically trying to reload his shotgun with trembling hands. "Fall back! Fall back!" he shrieked. Before Reed could chamber around, Declan was there. The Alpha King didn't even bother to shift. He grabbed Reed by the tactical vest, lifting him single-handedly off the floor, and slammed him against the freezing stone wall. "Who else?" Declan roared, his hand wrapping around Reed's throat. "Kensington is a coward. He doesn't have the funds to hire Aegis Solutions on his own. Who backed this assassination?" Reed spat blood onto the floor, choking under the Alpha's iron grip. "Go to hell, mutt." Hazel, still in her magnificent silver form, stalked forward. She let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the dust from the ceiling. She pressed her massive snout directly against Reed's face, her glowing white eyes piercing through his skull. The Crescent truth-seeking magic washed over the mercenary, violently ripping the deception from his mind. Reed convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head as the magical compulsion forced his jaw open. "Croft!" Reed screamed against his own will. "Richard Croft, the human billionaire! He wants the mineral rights under the Frost Peaks. Kensington promised him the land if Aegis took you out." Declan dropped the mercenary in disgust. Reed crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. "Richard Croft," Declan repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "The elite philanthropist. Good to know exactly whose empire I am going to burn to the ash." He looked down at the surviving mercenaries trembling on the floor. "Run. Tell Croft and Kensington that the Alpha King survived. And tell them he found his queen." The mercenaries didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the ruined tower, disappearing into the blinding whiteout. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the howling wind outside. Hazel looked at Declan, her massive silver tail swishing slowly behind her. With a soft, shimmering light, the giant wolf form began to shrink, the fur melting away, until Hazel was left standing on the cold stone floor in her ripped, oversized sweater. She collapsed, the sheer exhaustion of her first shift hitting her like a brick wall. Declan caught her before she hit the ground. He scooped her into his massive arms, pulling her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the overwhelming scent of pine, wild honey, and silver ash. "You're alive," Hazel whispered, her fingers weakly gripping the lapel of his ruined suit. "Because of you," Declan murmured fiercely. He tilted her chin up, his amber eyes burning with an intensity that stole the remaining breath from her lungs. "You are not a latent, Hazel. You are a crescent. You are ancient royalty, and you are mine." Before she could respond, the sound of heavy diesel engines cut through the storm. Headlights pierced the whiteout, and heavy armored transports ground to a halt outside the tower. Gideon, battered, bleeding, but very much alive, kicked through the remaining splinters of the door, flanked by a dozen heavily armed elite enforcers. The lead enforcer took one look at the carnage, then at the Alpha King holding the bleeding, exhausted girl. Gideon caught the lingering, overpowering scent of the crescent moonblood, a scent that commanded absolute biological reverence. Without a word, the giant enforcer dropped to one knee in the snow. Behind him, every single heavily armed soldier immediately followed suit, bowing their heads in unison. "Alpha," Gideon rumbled respectfully. "And Luna." Declan looked down at Hazel, a fierce, possessive pride radiating from his chest. The High Council wanted a puppet. They wanted a weak, easily manipulated mating contract to steal his throne. Instead, a foolish dare in a crowded ballroom had accidentally handed him the most powerful weapon in the Northern Territories. "Get the transports ready, Gideon," Declan ordered, carrying Hazel out of the frozen ruins and into the howling storm. "We are going back to the capital. We have a wedding to plan, a lord to execute, and a billionaire's empire to dismantle." The storm broke, leaving a reborn queen and her lethal king standing victorious in the bloody snow. Hazel Jenkins was no longer a hidden latent, but the resurrected heart of the Northern Pax. Hand in hand, they marched toward the stronghold, ready to rain absolute hellfire upon those who betrayed them. The Alpha King had caught her careless kiss, and in return, she had completely captured his fiercely guarded soul.